So yeah, it's great to be here. Great to be in the Paris meetings. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the fall armyworm invasion in New Zealand. Yeah, I thought this talk was a lot shorter than it was, but it did turn out to be 30 minutes. So because it's been a very short period of time that we've had this particular organism. So first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge my co-authors, Craig Phillips and Scott Hardwick, who actually have been doing much more of the work than I have been. One of the things that we do in New Zealand now is take more cognizance of the first peoples of the country, the Maori, and take on some of their customs in some of our work. And if any of you have been watching the rugby, for example, you will have seen the haka. And this is a little bit of a similar vein. So I'll just go straight through this very quickly. So it's sort of an introduction of myself. So ko Mount Ralston, ko Mātau te Manga, ko Waimakariri te Awa, ko Haraway / Atlantis te Waka, ko Wiwi Huguenot te Iwi, ko David Teulon tōku ingoa. So basically what this is saying is the special parts of the country to me, of New Zealand, is this area around Mount Ralston. And actually in this picture, you can see my son. We're out for a day there. It's just a little bit out of the city of Christchurch where I live. Ko Waimakariri te Awa, so that is the river that flows from this area of mountains down to the city. So that's also a special spot for me. Ko Haraway / Atlantis te Waka, so a waka is a canoe, and Maori take their lineage back to their waka, how they got to New Zealand. So the Haraway was the first ship that brought my family, my ancestors to New Zealand in 1858, and Atlantis was the ship that brought my mother to New Zealand in about 1949, I think. And ko Wiwi Huguenot te Iwi, so in Maori culture, you point out what tribe you came from or what tribes you came from. And my name, Teulon, is French Huguenot. And actually, this area of the country is where my ancestors came from. So this is a little bit like a homecoming for me, 300 years later. So that's just a little bit of interest. And here is the Huguenot cross, and we think this is our code, the Teulon coat of arms. Actually, nobody's very sure about it, but we have it on our wall, and this is the Huguenot cross. So that's a little bit about my history, about introducing myself. For the last 10 years, I've been director of a collaboration called Better Border Biosecurity, or B3. And this is a research collaboration of a number of different institutes, government organisations, also industry organisations and community as well, including Maori. And the aim of this collaboration is to stop invasive species coming into the country. And if they do come into the country, to eradicate them. So that's the focus of where I've come from for the last 10 years, managing that organisation and doing some of the research. Now, I've done a little bit of research on the side with it as well. It's been a great example of research collaboration in action with significant outcomes and impacts for our stakeholders. So I'm now going to talk a little bit, well, this is what I'm going to talk about today, the fall armyworm. I'm really going to look at 4 areas. I'm going to talk about the New Zealand biosecurity context, a little bit of preamble on the initial incursion of fall armyworm, then look briefly at the government and industry response, the operational side of things, and then talk a little bit more about some of the science that we tried to do in this very short period of time to mitigate the impacts, I guess, of fall armyworm. New Zealand values its plant systems very highly. I'm told it's one of the few first world economies that makes most of its money from plants. And in that context, I talk about grass, because our cows and sheep, etc., make us a lot of money, but they have to eat plants to do that. So our economy is based on plants and is a significant contribution to our wealth. We also have significant natural systems, considered a hotspot for biosecurity, and some of those plants also have significant social and cultural importance to both Maori and Pākehā. And again, I think if you think of the All Blacks, sorry, they're in town at the moment, nearly in town, but their symbol is a silver fern. So it's a plant again, so important cultural icon. And tourism. So tourism is one of our major industries. And of course, a lot of people come to New Zealand to look at the plant systems. So plants are important to New Zealand, and that's the focus of what we've been working on, and fall armyworm sort of falls under that. So here again is a little bit of an illustration of the picture that we deal with. New Zealand's an isolated country, as you can see, but there are a number of ways invasive species get into New Zealand, and these are them: through passengers, through mail, through craft, for example, through French yachtsmen coming in through New Caledonia, bringing fruit flies, that happens, cargoes and ships, and then the environment. And the environment is potentially the most significant pathway in the context of fall armyworm, because we believe it was blown over from Australia. So this is approximately a 3-hour flight in an aeroplane, but we have organisms crossing this part of the ocean and landing in New Zealand. I'll come back to that in terms of the fall armyworm a little bit later. Another illustration of the system that we work on is this invasion curve. B3 works down this end of it, trying to stop things coming to the country. And the argument there is this top line here. If we can stop things coming into the country, we have a much greater cost benefit in terms of prevention. So investing down here and stopping things coming into the country is hugely valuable in terms of the expected investment that we would need if something establishes, and we have to manage it for the rest of eternity. And the other image of our biosecurity system, which I think is important, some people see biosecurity or quarantine, whatever you like to call it, as a wall, a border. And this image really illustrates that it's much more than that. It's a series of activities starting way back pre-border, through the border, and then immediately post-border. And there are things in those positions, and they're all down here, I'm not going to go through them, that help us to stop these particular organisms or mitigate the number of organisms that actually establish. And hopefully we can pick out the worst ones. So that's a little bit of the biosecurity we have in the biosecurity system we have in New Zealand. The other thing that I'd like to point out, of course, is climate change. We're all aware of climate change. Well, I'm not sure if Donald Trump is, but most people are aware of climate change. And my view of climate change and biosecurity, so the biosecurity systems that we have largely been looking at data from the past. And the challenge, I think, for any biosecurity system is looking to what is going to happen ahead. And I think it's throwing a lot of, it's making the challenge much greater, because things are happening now, and this is partly what happened with the fall armyworm in New Zealand. Things are happening now that we didn't anticipate because things are changing so much. So that's our challenge going forward, I really believe. So the fall armyworm, just briefly, it's a noctuid moth. It's said to be a strong flyer. It originated in the Americas, has a wide host range, has no diapause, so it continually goes through generations given the right climate conditions. It's difficult to control. It's developed insecticide resistance in a number of places. And over the last 2 decades, it's been spreading rapidly around the world. And I think the next slide indicates that. So here we have with the origin area, movement to Africa, Asia, Australia, and now New Zealand. And we know from some of the research that we've carried out in the past that the correlation between an organism getting into New Zealand and it already being in Australia is very high. So we know as soon as something gets into Australia, there's a much greater likelihood of it turning up in New Zealand. And that's what happened here. It wasn't that long after it turned up in Australia that we started seeing it as well. I put this slide up because I think potentially we were a little bit complacent about this particular organism. So this is a risk assessment that was carried out in April 2021, which was before it landed. And it talks about very low risk. Very low risk. So yeah, it's easier to look at things in hindsight. Actually, it may well be true, but we'll move on to that. And even this fact sheet in March 2022 talks about the moth struggling to establish in New Zealand. So yeah, some complacency, I think. And here's a summary of the full risk assessment, and it's interesting that we look at some of the characterizations that are made within this risk assessment. We see wind dispersal is high, through adults is high, but then we come down to likelihood of establishment, and it's moderate. And again, hindsight is easy to evaluate things on, but you'd wonder if that particular risk assessment at that time was a little bit optimistic, let's say. And then some of the impacts, particularly in the environmental and socio-cultural area, potentially were a little bit lower than they could have been. So here is the full armyworm invasion timeline. And I'll start in 2020, which was before the organism was found in New Zealand. So it was it was a regulated organism. Quarantine organism had regulated pest status, so we knew about it. Of course, it was being a problem everywhere else. Then in late summer, early autumn 2022, it started turning up in New Zealand. And interestingly enough, the first sighting of it, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it was an egg mass of full armyworm was found on a spongy moth or gypsy moth trap. So these are traps that are put out to survey for gypsy moth, spongy moth, but this just happened to have full armyworm eggs on it, which was quite unusual. Anyway, soon after that, it started turning up in the fields, in maize crops around the country. And so in May 2022, a response was undertaken. So that response is like, we've got something new, what do we do about it? Et cetera, and I'll talk a bit more about that. We then had one of the warmest, we had the warmest winter on record following that incursion, and you can see that down here. So this is climate change, whatever, which I guess, again, when we think about the past, is that all of a sudden we have winters that are quite different than we used to have. We need to start thinking about that in terms of what it means for organisms coming into the country, especially organisms like this, which are more tropical than others. Then the following spring, after that very warm winter, the organism, the full armyworm, started turning up all over the place. And you can see on these red dots here, the green dots were the first year, the red dots were the second year. So all of a sudden, it's all over the country very, very quickly. And then at a certain point in time, in April 2022, the decision was made that it could not be eradicated. And we then progressed to a transition to long-term pest management. And then what's happened recently was we've had the 5th warmest winter on record, but late frosts in Northland up here, which I'll come back to in a little bit later. And so far we have no detections, but we didn't really see any detections until November anyway. So that's the timeline. It's quite a short period of time. that's come into the country is all over the country. We don't think we can't eradicate it. So now it's established. So the questions, we have other questions about it now. So this is a little bit about how things work in New Zealand. We have this thing called the Government Industry Agreement for Readiness and Response. So this is an agreement signed between industry bodies and the government, and they work together in terms of a response like this. And so you can, and they share costs, and in this case, the government was taking on 65% of the response costs and industry 35%, and these are the industries that were involved. These are the sort of things they do. So they do day-to-day management of the response. In this case, they didn't go to eradication, but they would be taking a significant role in that. They manage surveillance, so looking at public reporting, pheromone trapping, general crop scouting. They do extension, so letting people know what's going on, farmers in particular. And they funded some applied research, and that's some of the stuff I'll be talking about. So that's the operational side of the incursion. The science response, which I was more involved in, is some of it's found on this slide. So B3 knew that this was coming, this organism was coming. So we had invited experts over from Australia to help us prepare ourselves for this particular organism. And we funded some science meetings associated with that. And one of the other things that we did, and I'll come back to this in a bit more detail, we funded and supervised some young Maori students to work in this area up here. Because there was one thing that we were sure of, was that if this is going to be a problem anywhere, it's going to be a problem up here, because it's warmer up here, of course. And the other thing that is significant of this area up here, it's highly, the population of Maori in this area is quite high. So with this particular organism, we determined very quickly that there might be a disproportionate impact on Maori than there would be in the rest of the country associated with that. So we were trying to be proactive with Maori communities, let them know it was likely to come, and start getting them to start thinking about it. Some of the other areas of research, and I'll be going through some of this in a little bit more detail, although fairly briefly. We developed what we called a armyworm biosecurity science consultative group, which included researchers from New Zealand, but also researchers from Australia and Asia that had some experience with the particular organisms. And these were some of the projects that we started working on in this very short period of time that we had. And you don't need to worry about those now, because I'll be going through them briefly one by one. Here we go. So one of the first questions we have, can this overwinter in New Zealand? And Craig Phillips, one of my co-authors, he has an underlying question, is that all of these climate matching models that have been developed around the world, do they work well on a temperate island type climate that New Zealand has in the same way that they work on a continental climate where they potentially be developed. He tested various models using year-round distribution data of fall armyworm from the USA and China, so good data. And interestingly, he actually found a very simple explanation for some of the data, for some of the distribution that we have in New Zealand based on the 10%. The 10 degrees winter isotherm. And you can see in this slide here, these coloured areas indicate how many winters. This is out of 20, so that will be 16. Well, this colour here, yellow, there'll be 20 years out of 20 where the 10 degree C isotherm has not been exceeded. So you can see the likelihood of fall armyworm overwintering is most years is going to occur in this northern part, but there are other parts where it will occur from time to time. And if you remember what I said before, we just had the warmest winter on record. So the distribution based on this method was fairly extensive because of that very warm winter. It may not be in other winters, but it certainly wasn't this. So yeah, so we know it's going to overwinter in the north, and it's likely to overwinter elsewhere from time to time at least. One of the other things that we were looking at was the best way of monitoring this, and this is somewhat counterintuitive for a scientist who works in semiochemicals. We normally believe that a pheromone or an attractant works much more effectively than doing crop scouting. In this case, it did not. And I was asked why that is, and I don't know the answer, but in this case, going into the crop was you were more likely to find the organism there. So important information for finding it. Pathways to and within New Zealand. Oh, there's a typo there. So one of the important papers on fall armyworm recently countered the general thinking that this thing just blows around the world. This paper here by Rain et al. 2023, and their suggestion was that the rates of incursions based on molecular data were better explained by the movement of trade, not by wind. In New Zealand, it's quite interesting. You saw where all those dots were all over the country. The assumption in New Zealand was that it was definitely by wind. It's very hard to prove that, of course, but it is suggested that that is the case. And we know historically that we do get incursions from Australia, particularly insects, from time to time, fairly regularly, I think we could say. And also with pathogens as well. So we have some plant pathogens that probably have been blown across the Tasman Sea. And here are some of the work that's been done to try and model those air movements. We also, when the fires occur in Australia, we see the smoke coming into New Zealand, so we know that the particles coming in. So things, they fly. Things come across the Tasman. And then the other thing here is how can they move around the country? And there is some evidence that they are being moved internally within New Zealand on wind patterns, and I'll come to one of those in a minute. Anyway, so this is some of the other work that's being done, is to try and understand how they get into New Zealand, how often does this occur, and how they can move through the country. And one of the reasons for not going to eradication was that what's the point? They're going to blow in next year, so let's not do that. Just a waste of money. I've touched on this a little bit. So impacts of plants of value to Maori. Now, fall armyworm has two different strains, I guess. One of them is the rice strain, and one of them is the corn strain. Early on, and I think actually there's quite a bit of debate about this, we learned from the conference up north. Early on, anyway, we thought we had the rice strain, and so we were all of a sudden concerned about grasses. And Maori use grasses in many ways. So this is, I think, this is the social, cultural side of things. It's not just economic, but these are important things to their society. And some of these plants are threatened in other ways. And so having something coming in on top of that was again something that we wanted to work through with Maori, so they were ready for what was going to happen, if it was going to happen. So that was some of the work that we went through and helped share that with Maori communities. It just happens, and that this particular strain, whatever it is, has largely been found on corn. And that's probably true in Australia. It's actually true worldwide, it seems. So in New Zealand, it's almost wholly been found on corn. It hasn't moved on to much else at all. And probably these small cases where there was such a high population that had to move somewhere else to find a bit more food. It wasn't developing populations there at all. And the other thing that was important, we have several species of armyworms in New Zealand. And it just so happened that when the fall armyworm came in, one of those armyworms, I think I can't remember, it's the cosmopolitan or the tropical armyworm, also had an outbreak that year. So there was a lot of confusion by farmers, et cetera, what they actually had. And some of these armyworms, the larvae of some of these armyworms are very, very similar. So we started getting information out there to help people know what they were dealing with. Partly because in a response, they are obliged to report to the government if they have this organism on their property or not. But yeah, also just that information is very useful for determining what to do in a response. And I think this is next to my last slide. So this is the challenge that I think I'm not sure if I made it clearly enough at the Adelaide conference, but this issue here about what strain we've got is actually quite important. So initially we thought we had the rice strain, and actually the current CO1 markers for what we have in New Zealand indicate that we do have the rice strain. So we got very concerned about this particular organism going on to grasses, as you saw. It seems that whatever it is, it's sticking to corn. So is this marker accurate? Well, possibly not. And we actually had somebody talk at the conference that there was another way of looking at this. I didn't completely understand it, but yeah. So the markers and understanding the genomics of these particular organisms is actually quite valuable in understanding what to do with recursion when it happens. And I think, the other thing that I would like to talk about, and I'm very near the end of my talk now, is this organism now is going through the Pacific. This is our neighbourhood. It's in Papua New Guinea, it's in the Solomons, and it's in Vanuatu. And of course, the Pacific is also France has a significant interest in the Pacific as well. I'll come to the... So one of the things I'm interested in while I'm over here is can we think about collaborations, further collaborations than we have in terms of the current one, but looking at organisms like fall armyworm in the Pacific, given that New Zealand has now joined the EU, Horizons EU, as an associated member, so we can get fully funded. And France is probably the other main partner in the Pacific that has interests in these things. So I'm thinking a New Zealand-French approach here might be really, really worthwhile. So in summary, fall armyworm is now firmly established in New Zealand. It seems to be largely associated with maize and sweet corn. The extent to which fall armyworm will overwinter and develop damaging populations is still being determined. I think we can't tell that very easily from 1 or 2 seasons. It does have the ability to overwinter in New Zealand, and certainly in the north, we think the north is going to be an issue. That ability will likely increase with climate change, and we're potentially seeing that. And it may be a pest in some years in some places, than more so than others. I think I've said this, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.